It is a day today when we remember those who have gone before us. In the life of the church, we call that All Saints' Day. And so it's appropriate that we read a story, a solemn story, a story of Jesus encountering this Mary and this Martha, these two sisters whose brother has died. It's an interesting story. Lazarus he hasn't just died. In fact, the story tells us that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. In the passage that precedes this, it talks about how Mary and Martha, they had gone to the tomb and they anointed Lazarus' body with spices, with ointments. Of course, there was no embalming in those days. And so they did that, hopefully, to take care of smells and things like that. And they had placed his body then in a tomb. And we often wonder why did they place bodies in tombs? It wasn't a grave place. Again, they had no embalming, so they placed bodies into these tombs as a place where the body would decompose. And then days later, months later, they would come back and collect all the remains and place them in a box, and that they would bury. Lazarus was already in the tomb. He wasn't just dead, he was really dead. And Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, they do what we do in times of loss, in times of grief. They turn to Jesus and say, if you had been here, if only you had been here, our brother would have died. And then the story says that they wept. They wept. Each one of us have experienced loss. We know that type of weeping. We know what it's like to ask those questions. Why, God? Why cancer? Why the death of my loved one? Why the loss of my parent? Why the loss of my child? Why the loss of my spouse? We know those questions. We know the question, what did we do to deserve that? What did my spouse do to deserve that? We know those questions, what if? Jesus, if only you had been here. We know the pain of Mary and Martha because we know loss. All of us know loss. It's interesting, as a pastor, I find myself often in places and times where there's loss, where there's pain. And I find it really interesting how we often deal with loss, with pain. And I find that we have sort of an aversion to pain. We have an aversion to loss, which I think can be a good thing. But I think sometimes not so good. You see, in fear of grief, I think we respond in two ways. When grief happens, the first response is often we try to escape it. We try to minimize the pain. We stuff it down inside. We tell ourselves, well, it isn't so bad. There are people who are worse off. I just need to buck up. And we often seclude ourselves. We stuff that pain, that loss, that hurt deep down inside. Or we respond by giving what I call easy answers. When my mother passed away, I was a young boy, and I remember very distinctly someone coming up to me just after the funeral, and they looked me in the eyes and they said, Hans, I know this hurts now, and we don't understand it, but God needed another angel in heaven. It wasn't really satisfactory to me. I think we do this, and maybe we Christians are most guilty of this. Rather than calling funerals, I've often heard of them called celebrations. We want to celebrate the life as though we should sugarcoat the pain. We say things like, well, we don't understand, but it's all part of God's plan. We offer easy answers, I think, all too quickly. You see, in our reading today, it's interesting how Jesus reacts to the pain of Mary and Martha. You see, Jesus doesn't try to minimize their pain or tell them it's all going to be okay. Jesus doesn't give easy answers or try to explain it all away. Jesus doesn't move away from their pain, their loss, and their tears. But the story says that seeing Mary and Martha in pain, Jesus weeps. Jesus weeps. When I was an intern pastor out in Washington, I remember one funeral in particular. The funeral was about to begin and no one was there. I looked out into the gathering area at that church. No one was in there. The organist was sitting at the organ. The casket was in the front of the sanctuary, but no one was there. I said, "Where is everybody?" And the secretary of the church said, "Look outside." And I walked out the front door of the church, and there was all the family, all this deceased man's friends. And I said, "Guys, it's time to start." No, we'll get there. It's time to start. Do we have to? As I talked with that family, I realized they did not want to face what was about to happen. That they had to say goodbye for a final time. We tried to put barriers between ourselves and our loss. And so Jesus in our story, he doesn't do that. Instead, it says that Jesus weeps. What if rather than thinking of God as some distant being in our times of loss, some distant being that has some mysterious plan, what if we were to envision God weeping, God present in our pain, sort of like he was for Mary and Martha? What if God was the first one to weep when we experience loss? And maybe in times of loss, maybe that's where healing comes. It's not from easy answers or being tough, not from sugarcoating or hiding our loss, not by turning away from it, but maybe healing comes the way Jesus offers it. It says Jesus weeps. And I think in weeping, he enters more deeply into that loss. It's always interesting to me that in order for Jesus to offer healing in this story, the stone of that tomb must be rolled away. And the stench wafts out, the story says. And Jesus enters that dark, damp, ugly place, the tomb. Because he must. Because he wants to. Because for Jesus, it's only in entering into our darkness, entering into our real pain, our real loss, that healing can happen. It's only when those tears flow that healing arrives. It's in knowing that Jesus walks alongside us, not as some distant being. It's knowing that Jesus walks into those dark places. And I think we find healing. Folks, today's All Saints' Day. And it might be strange, it might feel sort of like a funeral you've come to. But we all know loss. We all know loss. And today we remember that in our loss, we have a God who promises to walk with us in our loss. A God who enters deeply into our dark moments of pain. A God who doesn't just give easy answers, but a God who is the first to weep when we know loss and pain. And this is the good news. Let's be with it. Amen.